Well, I have to say that in my 25 plus years practicing in clinical governance and undertaking open disclosure, nothing has been more personally and professionally challenging to undertaking open disclosure when there's been the death of a child in the facility that I've worked in. And because the circumstances there are so complex, so emotional, and understandably of such significance, I think it's imperative that healthcare leaders should step forward and undertake this open disclosure with the clinicians involved. It's not reasonable to send the clinicians out front and to undertake all of that themselves. It's simply unreasonable to do so. And from a board and executive perspective, members of the boards and executive should be able to undertake open disclosure as part of their role in particular and be trained to do so and do it properly when something like this happens, if there's been a death of a child. You should be able to say sorry where it's appropriate. If the death of the child was preventable and it's occurred in your facility, apologising is mandatory. But in addition, it's about responsibility and accountability now. And having been in this position, unfortunately, a few times, in one circumstance, for me personally, the situation was so preventable that speaking to the parents, I was prepared and offered them my resignation in my role because at some point the accountability had to rest somewhere. And I asked the parents if it made a difference, I would resign. And they were very gracious and didn't request that. On reflection, it was unfair of me to put them in that position because it wasn't about me, it was about their child, and I learnt a lot from them. They taught me how to be a better open disclosure practitioner, even though I've been well trained and understand my role. Listening, getting the feedback from the parents in this situation was critical because what they wanted wasn't my resignation or my more and more of my apologies, but my commitment to actually implement the change. Not only committed to it, but come back to them, which I did many times, months, years later, to say we are on top of this, to prove that the organisation had learnt and our commitment to the change was demonstrable by the implementation and review. So you learn a lot. And it really underscores you can't just do this type of training in clinical governance from a textbook. You can't just do it from people who are well-meaning but have never actually sat in front of a patient or a family and done these complex open disclosures. You need to learn from practitioners who've been on the front line, who've been on the tools, who have been there and understand what it's like, and who can express with you the challenges and gain from the experiences they have so you can modify that. And then finally, no one can teach you better than the patient. So asking frankly to them at some point how the response to your open disclosure was and what you should do better is very important.
Thanks, Lewis. I think that example you shared is actually quite a powerful reminder for us as to why we're doing open disclosure and the whole process of it not being a compliance thing. And I think, whether you accept blame, I wouldn't call it blame, but accepting responsibility or accepting that you may have failed to act or to not act in preventing that incident comes from the culture of the organization as well, doesn't it? Because at the end of the day, we are responsible for what we are providing. And part of that leadership skill set is to be accountable for both the positives and the negatives. And as a healthcare leader, to say, I failed to monitor the system the way that it should have been, or actually sets an example even for our clinicians to feel confident to say, we failed to provide the right amount of care or whatever procedure it is to the family. And I think what that does is it sets an example for the clinicians and tells them they don't have to be afraid to take responsibility, to take accountability for any mistakes and things that happen, because at the end of the day, everyone's human and these are inevitable. And I think that if we do approach it from really that authentic, transparent place, it does resonate a lot. And I don't have an example as powerful as Lewis's, but I every time that I have authentically conveyed any responsibility I or other clinicians have had in an incident to a patient. I remember on one occasion, the patient's mother was actually telling me, "It's okay, dear, I'm sure you did your best." So, because it was to that degree that, I think you have to embody what it means and what the impact is to the family in terms of that era.
Yes, I think that it's amazing to me still how generous patients and their families are
Mhm.
in circumstances during open disclosure when it's genuine and authentic. What I can't really stand is when you look into a situation and find that the open disclosure is being ticked as done and you inquire and it's been a meeting or a discussion held in the acute phase of a discovery of something such as in our scenario here of child's past, and that's it. Open disclosure is much more than a tick in a box into your incident management system or a compliance driven one-off meeting, and which people come back from thinking, oh, that went well, and the patient and their family are still in a reeling with regards to understanding what's occurred. So authentic open disclosure, authentic discussions and communications with patients, they're the ones who can judge, as we said earlier. And I am, like you said, Sydney, very humbled by how patients and their families are often respond in those circumstances because they see the commitment and the ownership. They're often much more generous than probably we deserve. In saying that, at the end of the day, even if they're angry, even if they never remove from anger, which they may very well be 100% entitled to, it doesn't change our commitment and our responsibilities. In fact, if you haven't had people being angry at you and unforgiving and not accepting of your discussion, then you haven't done enough open disclosures. I finally say what I said, I repeat what I said earlier in the session. It is key that board directors are well trained in this space. You have to understand what open disclosure is. You can't sit on a healthcare board, hear the term, and don't understand what it is. You need to understand it, and health executives need to participate. You need to be involved. You need to have been there with your colleagues, particularly the clinician colleagues, so you understand what it means. And that means you need to be well trained. You can't just be there on the side watching as if on TV. And finally, my comment is, if you want to know what the right thing to do, ask the non-clinicians in your hospital. Go to your executive support team. Go to the managers of units and say, in such circumstance, what should we do? I tell you, the non-clinicians of your hospital will always guide you well and how you should respond in a clinical incident, how the open disclosure goes. They are representative of the community. The advantage you have is they are your colleagues. And when they say, you should go and talk to the family and tell them this is what they're expecting. Having sessions with them where you explain your clinical governance so they understand what the hospital's doing and asking for their feedback as part of training, you will get wonderful, wonderful cues from them, wonderful responses that can really help your organisation set the appropriate tone.